The crystal champagne flute felt unnaturally heavy in Robert Whitmore's hand. He swirled the bubbling, pale gold liquid, watching the light from the massive chandelier fracture into 1,000 tiny rainbows against the glass. The air in his living room, a space larger than most family homes, was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, imported orchids, and the self-satisfied murmur of money talking to money. It was his annual summer soirée, a carefully curated gathering of the city's elite, and everything was, as always, perfect. The canapes were exquisite, the conversation was insipidly brilliant, and the view of the Beverly Hills sunset from his floor-to-ceiling windows was a masterpiece of natural art that he felt he had personally commissioned. He was holding court. From his Italian leather armchair, a throne of buttery soft calfskin that had cost more than his housekeeper's annual salary, his guests a collection of oil tycoons, real estate magnates, and their jewel-draped wives, hung on his every word, their laughter a symphony of practiced sycophancy. He was telling a story about a hostile takeover, a tale of corporate bloodshed, that he recounted with the detached amusement of a Roman emperor, describing a particularly entertaining gladiatorial contest. But a flicker of boredom, a familiar gnawing dissatisfaction, began to prick at the edges of his contentment. The performance was growing stale. He needed a new diversion, a fresh spectacle to remind his audience, and himself, of the natural order of things, of his place at the apex of this carefully constructed world. His eyes scanned the room, gliding past the silk gowns and tailored suits, and landed on a small, unobtrusive figure moving silently along the periphery. A ghost in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a neat, severe bun. She was collecting empty glasses with a quiet efficiency that was designed to make her invisible. "Sophia, come here now," Robert's voice boomed across the room, a whip-crack of command that sliced through the polite chatter, instantly silencing it. Every head turned. The ghost, his housekeeper's daughter, froze mid-step, a crystal glass held delicately in her small hand. Sophia, all of 12 years old, looked up, her large, dark eyes wide with a familiar, startled apprehension. She was helping her mother, Carmen, serve the guests, a task she performed with a solemn grace that was at odds with her age. She approached him timidly, her worn-out sneakers, a stark violation of the room's aesthetic, making no sound on the immaculate white marble floor. Her hands were still slightly damp from washing dishes in the cavernous, stainless steel kitchen. Around her, the 6 men in their bespoke suits and their wives, dripping with diamonds that could fund a small country, watched her with a look she knew all too well. It was a look that x-rayed her, assessed her, and dismissed her in a single, sweeping glance, a mixture of mild curiosity and profound, unthinking disdain. The look one gives to a particularly unusual piece of furniture. "My friends are bored," Robert declared, a cruel, lazy smile playing on his lips. He gestured with his champagne flute toward the magnificent Steinway grand piano that dominated a corner of the room, its polished ebony surface gleaming like a black mirror. "How about you entertain us a little? I understand your mother says you play the piano." From the plush velvet sofa across the room, a malicious giggle erupted. It was Victoria Whitmore, Robert's 16-year-old daughter, a girl sculpted from the same privileged clay as her father. She held up her diamond-encrusted smartphone, her thumb hovering over the record button. "Daddy, be serious," she drawled, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty of the terminally entitled. "She can barely read. How is she going to play the piano?" A ripple of appreciative laughter went through the guests. It was the perfect joke for this audience, a witty affirmation of their shared worldview. The little maid, playing the piano. The very idea was absurd, a delightful little farce. Sophia felt the heat of a deep, painful blush rise up her neck, but she did not look down. She stood straight, her posture imbued with a quiet dignity her mother had instilled in her since birth. "La cabeza en alto, mi hija," Carmen would whisper to her every night. "Head held high, my daughter, no matter what." From the doorway of the kitchen, Carmen watched, her face a tense mask of worry. She held an empty silver tray to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white. She knew she should intervene, should make an excuse, say her daughter was tired, that she didn't know how to play well enough for such an important audience. But she also knew her place in this house. She was a fixture, a function, not a person with a voice. To speak up would be an act of insubordination, an unforgivable breach of the invisible but unbreakable contract that governed their lives. "Come on, go," Robert insisted, his voice laced with impatience. He clapped his hands together, a sharp, commanding sound that made Sophia flinch. "Play something simple. Happy birthday, perhaps. My friends will get a kick out of watching you try. What those millionaires in their cocoon of wealth and willful ignorance, didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was the secret life Sophia lived before their world even stirred from its slumber. They didn't know that she woke at 5 o'clock every morning, dressing in the cold pre-dawn darkness, and walked 6 blocks to the old, abandoned St. Michael's Church. They didn't know about Father Martinez, the elderly Colombian priest who saw not the housekeeper's daughter, but a soul brimming with a gift from God, and who unlocked the church doors for her every morning so she could practice on the battered, out-of-tune upright piano in the parish hall. They didn't know that the calluses on her small, delicate-looking hands weren't just from helping her mother scrub floors and polish silver. They were the hard-won badges of a discipline that bordered on obsession, the result of 8 years of relentless, secret practice. They were the calluses of an artist. Sophia walked slowly toward the piano, each step an eternity. She was acutely aware of the condescending whispers that followed her, of the glint of Victoria's phone, of the weight of her mother's silent, terrified prayers. She sat down on the padded leather bench, the seat still warm from where a professional musician had been playing jazz standards earlier in the evening. She adjusted the height, a small, precise movement of a seasoned performer. Ignoring the snickers from the audience, Robert crossed his arms, settling back in his throne, a look of smug anticipation on his face. He was ready for the cheap entertainment, the clumsy, fumbling notes that would confirm his own superiority and provide a delightful anecdote for his next dinner party. Victoria zoomed in with her phone, eager to capture the inevitable failure. For posterity, for the likes, for the cruel, fleeting validation of her social media bubble. For a long, suspended moment, Sophia hesitated, her hands hovering over the pristine ivory and ebony keys. She could play Happy Birthday, she could play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, she could fulfill their expectations, be the clumsy, amusing little maid, and then retreat back into the safety of her invisibility. Her mother would be relieved, their jobs would be secure, their fragile existence would remain undisturbed. But then, something shifted in her eyes. A silent internal battle was fought and won in the space of a single heartbeat, a quiet, steely determination, a force that only exists in those who carry secrets too powerful to be contained, rose up to meet the wall of their contempt. Thought of her mother's tears, of the years of quiet humiliation, of the boundless, soaring world of music that lived inside her, a world they could never touch, never comprehend. And she made a choice. If you have ever witnessed the exact moment when someone who has been underestimated their entire life is about to silence all their critics, then you know that the silence before the storm carries a special, electric energy. It is the sound of a paradigm about to shatter. The keys of the Steinway gleamed under the opulent light of the crystal chandelier, a perfect, silent keyboard of 88 promises. Sophia adjusted her posture on the bench, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed. It was a posture of command, a posture taught to her not in an expensive conservatory, but in a dusty church hall by a priest who remembered what it was to be a master. Robert Whitmore took a theatrical sip of his $1,000 glass of red wine and leaned back in his armchair, a modern-day emperor in his Colosseum ready for the spectacle. Silence, everyone, he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity. Let's see if the exorbitant taxes I pay for these public schools were worth a damn thing. The laughter that followed was sharp and brittle, the sound of crystal shattering against marble. Victoria, his daughter, pointed her phone at Sophia, her thumb poised over the share button, already imagining the viral caption, "Oh my God, you guys, my dad is making the maid's daughter play our piano. So cringe." At her side, Margaret Steinberg, the wife of an oil tycoon whose face was a testament to the miracles of modern cosmetic surgery, whispered loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "Poor dear. She probably can't even read the notes properly. It's a different alphabet for them, you know." From the kitchen doorway, Carmen watched, her hands trembling as she clutched the empty silver tray. It was happening, the thing she had both dreamed of and dreaded her entire life. She knew what her daughter was capable of. She had nurtured that gift, cultivated it in secret, shielded it from a world that would not understand. But she also knew the price of revealing it. In this house, in this world, they were invisible by necessity, not by choice. To be seen was to be judged, and to be judged by these people was to be found wanting. Their survival depended on their ability to blend into the background, to be as unremarkable as the polished silverware and the starched linen napkins. What these millionaires didn't know, as they prepared to feast on a child's humiliation, was the story behind the silent, stoic woman in the doorway. They didn't know that Carmen had grown up listening to her own mother cry softly in the bathroom after particularly grueling, humiliating days at the Whitmore mansion. They didn't know that Carmen herself had once been a celebrated classical pianist in her native Colombia, a rising star in the Bogotá Symphony, before violence and political upheaval had forced her to flee to the United States. They didn't know that her conservatory degrees, her accolades, her entire life's work, had turned to worthless paper the moment she crossed the border, and that her hands, once celebrated for their ability to coax magic from a keyboard, had been relegated to scrubbing the toilets of people who would never play a single correct note in their lives. "Come on, honey," Robert encouraged, his voice dripping with a false syrupy kindness that was more insulting than any overt cruelty. "Play something we all know. How about Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? I'm sure you can manage that." Charles Morrison, the owner of a chain of luxury hotels whose personal ethics were as questionable as his business practices, laughed so hard he almost spilled his 30-year-old single malt scotch. "Robert, you're a menace. The girl probably doesn't even know which keys are the black ones and which are the white ones." It was then that Sophia looked up. For the first time since she had sat down at the piano, she lifted her gaze from the keys and let it sweep slowly, deliberately, across every face in the room. She saw Robert with his condescending smile. She saw Victoria with her phone held high like a weapon. She saw the guests, their faces masks of cruel, eager amusement. For a fleeting moment, something flashed in her eyes, a flicker of something ancient and powerful, and the atmosphere in the room grew suddenly tense, the air charged and heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. "May I choose the song?" Sophia asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried a surprising, unnerving firmness that cut through the haze of alcohol and arrogance. "Of course, dear," Robert replied, gesturing magnanimously, playing the part of the benevolent patron. "Play whatever you can manage. We're not here to judge. We're just here to have a bit of fun." What Robert didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was the sheer, staggering scale of the secret world of music that Sophia inhabited. He didn't know that every morning, while he slept in his $15,000 temperature-controlled bed, Sophia was walking through the cold, dark streets to the sanctuary of St. Michael's Church. He didn't know that Father Martinez, the old Colombian priest, had been a conservatory pianist in Bogotá before taking his vows, and that he had recognized the girl's raw, untamed genius the very first day she had shyly appeared at the church door, asking if she could just play a little, please. He didn't know that Father Martinez had become her secret mentor, sharing decades of musical knowledge, teaching her theory, technique, and interpretation, pushing her to reach for octaves that were still too big for her small hands. "Mia," the priest would say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Talent knows no zip code, but discipline is what separates the dreamers from the artists." He didn't know that Carmen, his housekeeper, spent the $15 a month she saved from her meager salary on used sheet music she bought from a street vendor in downtown LA, hiding the precious scores in the back of her closet like they were stolen treasures. He didn't know that every night, long after the great house was silent, Sophia would practice on the wooden kitchen table, her fingers dancing over the imaginary keys, the complex melodies of Bach, Beethoven, and Chopin playing in her head, learned from recordings on a broken smartphone Carmen had found in the trash and painstakingly repaired. Victoria laughed again, a high, sharp sound that grated on the nerves. She brought her phone closer, preparing for the viral moment. "Dad, this is going to be epic." A maid, trying to play our $200,000 Steinway. $250,000, Robert corrected her, a proud proprietary smile on his face. "But who's counting, right?" As the guests continued their cruel, self-congratulatory jokes, Carmen closed her eyes in the kitchen doorway. She knew her daughter was about to make a decision that would change their lives, for better or for worse, forever. Sophia could play something simple, something childish. She could remain invisible, and in doing so, preserve their jobs, their home, their fragile existence. Or, Sophia took a deep, centering breath. Her hands, small and calloused, positioned themselves over the keys with a grace and a precision that did not go unnoticed by her mother. It was the same posture Carmen herself had taught her so many years ago, in a different life, a different world, a world where she still believed that talent was enough to open any door. "I hope you like Chopin," Sophia said, her voice calm and clear, and then her fingers finally touched the keys. The silence that followed was not the polite, expectant silence of a concert hall. It was the absolute, profound, stunned silence of people who have just realized that they have made a catastrophic, world-altering miscalculation, but do not yet know the full extent of their error. And in Sophia's eyes, for the first time that night, there was a spark of defiance, of power, of genius, a spark that made even Robert Whitmore, the king in his castle, shift uncomfortably in his Italian leather armchair. The game had begun. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, No. 2, emerged from the Steinway not as a clumsy fumbling, but as a delicate, crystalline whisper. The sound was so pure, so technically correct, that it made Robert Whitmore physically frown. It wasn't the out-of-tune, hesitant plinking he had been anticipating, the sound he had been priming his guests to ridicule. It was precise, it was clean, but it was still, he told himself, nothing to be truly impressed by. A party trick, perhaps. Well, at least she knows where the keys are. Charles Morrison, the hotel magnate, muttered to Margaret Steinberg. They both chuckled, but their laughter was a little less certain now, a little more subdued. Victoria continued to record, but a flicker of confusion crossed her face. She was already trying to think of a new, more ironic caption. When your maid thinks she can play classical piano, and actually kind of can. Lol. Sophia continued to play, her small hands navigating the familiar landscape of the keys with an ease that began to command a reluctant attention. Robert leaned forward slightly in his throne, his brow furrowed. The girl's technique was surprisingly good, not just good for a 12-year-old, but good by any standard. Not perfect, perhaps, but far, far beyond what he had imagined possible from someone who, in his mind, had learned to play in a dilapidated public school music room, if at all. Robert didn't know what was utterly beyond the scope of his comprehension, was the sheer staggering depth of Sophia's secret education. He didn't know about the 8 years of 5 a.m. mornings, of walking through the cold, dark, empty streets of Beverly Hills to the sanctuary of St. Michael's Church. He didn't know that Father Martinez, the old Colombian priest who let her in, had been a celebrated conservatory pianist in Bogota before he had taken his vows. A man whose love for God was matched only by his love for the great composers. He didn't know that the priest had recognized the girl's raw, once-in-a-generation talent the very first day she had appeared at his door. A small, shy 4-year-old clutching her mother's hand, asking if she could just touch the pretty black and white keys of the old parish hall piano. He didn't know that for years. While Carmen had been scrubbing the floors of the Whitmore mansion, Sophia had been receiving a world-class musical education, practicing on a battered, out-of-tune upright piano from 1972, her small hands stretching to master octaves that were still too big for her, her mind absorbing decades of musical knowledge from a master who had thought his teaching days were long behind him. As Sophia reached the first lyrical climax of the piece, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred in the atmosphere of the room. The whispers stopped, the clinking of glasses ceased. The sound coming from the piano was no longer just technically competent. It had acquired something else. It had soul. It had interpretation. It had a profound melancholic beauty that spoke of a wisdom far beyond her years. There were years of pain, of hope, of quiet, unyielding dedication flowing through every note. From the kitchen doorway, Carmen watched, tears beginning to well in her eyes, blurring the opulent scene before her. She recognized every nuance of that performance, every subtle shift in tempo, every delicate press of the keys, because she was the one who had first placed Sophia's hands on a keyboard when the girl was only 4 years old, in a different life, a different country. Carmen had been the first violinist in the Medellin Symphony Orchestra before the violence that was consuming her hometown had forced her to flee, leaving behind her career, her home, her entire identity. Her diplomas, her achievements, her life as a celebrated musician, all of it had been reduced to ash the moment she stepped onto American soil, where she became just another immigrant, another housekeeper, another invisible woman. But she had never stopped teaching her daughter. In the dead of night, in the small, cramped staff quarters at the back of the Whitmore estate, after the great house was dark and silent, Carmen would whisper music theory while Sophia practiced silent scales on the wooden kitchen table. She spent her meager $15-a-month allowance on used sheet music, building a secret library of the great masters, a hidden world of beauty and art in the back of their small closet. Robert began to shift uncomfortably in his chair. The music was beautiful, more than beautiful. It was deeply, profoundly moving, and that was not part of the plan. He had wanted a spectacle, not a symphony. He had wanted a confirmation of his own superiority, not a challenge to it. He was being forced to confront the possibility that he had made a catastrophic, world-altering miscalculation, and the feeling was deeply, profoundly unsettling that it was at that moment that the front door of the mansion opened, and a woman walked in who would change everything. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief music critic for the Los Angeles Times and a personal friend of Robert's, had arrived early for the dinner party that was scheduled to follow the cocktail hour. She stopped dead in the grand foyer, her hand still on the doorknob, frozen by the sound that was pouring from the main living room. Patricia had spent 40 years of her life immersed in the world of classical music. She had heard the world's greatest virtuosos perform in the grand concert halls of Vienna, in the historic conservatories of Moscow, in the state-of-the-art auditoriums of New York. Her ears were finely tuned instruments, capable of discerning the slightest imperfection, the most subtle nuance, and what she was hearing now, coming from the living room of Robert Whitmore's mansion, was undeniably, breathtakingly extraordinary. Without making a sound, she tiptoed to the entrance of the room and peered inside. The scene that greeted her was surreal. A small, 12-year-old black girl, dressed in the simple, severe uniform of a domestic worker, was performing Chopin on a concert grand piano with an interpretive maturity and a technical command that rivaled professional, world-renowned pianists. She saw the girl's hands, too small for some of the broader, more demanding chords, find ingenious, creative solutions, alternate fingerings that did not compromise the musical integrity of the piece in the slightest. It was the mark of a true, natural-born musician. My God, Patricia whispered to herself, a thrill of pure professional excitement running down her spine. She recognized, with the unshakable certainty of a lifetime of experience, that she was witnessing something rare, something precious, something that came along perhaps once in a generation. Meanwhile, inside the room, Victoria had stopped recording. The mocking smile had long since vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. The adults were no longer laughing, they were listening, really listening. Some of them, like Margaret Steinberg, seemed genuinely, deeply impressed. Others, like Charles Morrison, just looked confused, as if the world had suddenly stopped making sense. "Daddy," Victoria whispered to her father, her voice a small lost sound. "How much longer is she going to play?" Robert didn't answer. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own home, forced to confront the undeniable, impossible truth. The music coming from his piano wasn't just good, it wasn't just great, it was exceptional, and it was coming from a source that his entire life, his entire worldview, his entire system of prejudice, had categorized as impossible. Sophia was nearing the end of the nocturne, her hands dancing across the keys with a confidence that grew. With each passing bar, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. She could sense that she had captured their attention, that she had earned, through the sheer force of her talent, a grudging, astonished respect. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the Chopin was just the warm-up. Father Martinez had taught her something fundamental, a lesson learned from a lifetime of navigating a world that often sought to diminish him. "Mia," he had told her, "when they try to put you in a small box, you do not just show them that you can get out of the box, you show them that you can build a cathedral." And Sophia had saved her true, extraordinary talent, her cathedral of sound, for this very moment, because after the Chopin she planned to play her own composition, a piece she had created in secret, a piece inspired by the silent tears she had seen her mother shed every night, by the daily humiliations they had both endured, and by the stubborn, defiant hope that refused to die, no matter how much the world tried to extinguish it. When the last lingering notes of the nocturne echoed through the room, and a profound, heavy silence fell, Sophia took a deep breath. She looked up, her gaze sweeping past the stunned faces of the guests, and settled directly on Robert Whitmore. Her eyes no longer carried the shy, timid uncertainty of the girl who had been summoned to perform a party trick. They carried the quiet, unshakable determination of someone who was about to rewrite all the rules of the game. "That was the easy part," Sophia said, her voice calm and clear, carrying across the silent room. She adjusted her posture on the bench, a small, deliberate movement. "Now, I'm going to play something I composed. I wrote it with you in mind." The first notes of Sophia's original composition did not so much break the silence as they seeped into it, an auditory earthquake that began as a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. It was nothing like the familiar, romantic melancholy of Chopin. This was something else entirely, something new, something raw, something born of the unique, painful beauty of a life lived in the shadows. The melody began softly, a tentative, whispered phrase that mimicked the sound of Carmen's soft-souled shoes on the polished marble floors of the mansion before dawn. It was the sound of invisibility, of a life lived on the periphery. Then, the melody began to grow, to evolve, incorporating a steady, rhythmic pulse in the left hand that was reminiscent of the quiet, persistent heartbeat of a mother who works 16 hours a day to give her daughter a chance at a life she herself was denied. Sophia's fingers, which had so masterfully navigated the complexities of Chopin, now danced across the keys with a new kind of authority. This was her language, her story. From the grand entrance of the living room, Dr. Patricia Williams moved closer, drawn by an irresistible professional gravity. She discreetly pulled out her smartphone and began to record, not with the malicious intent of a teenager, but with the reverent urgency of an archivist witnessing the creation of a masterpiece. In her 40 years as one of the nation's preeminent music critics, she had rarely, if ever, witnessed such compositional maturity, such a sophisticated and emotionally resonant voice, in someone so young. Robert Whitmore had stopped drinking his wine. The crystal glass remained suspended in the air, halfway to his lips, forgotten. He was trying to process what he was hearing, but the music defied his categories, his understanding of the world. This wasn't just a collection of pleasant sounds, it was a narrative, a complete, complex, heart-wrenching symphony of experiences that he could never fully comprehend, but which, to his profound and growing discomfort, touched him in some deep, inexplicable way. Victoria, his daughter, slowly lowered her own phone. The video she had planned to post, the one that was meant to be a monument to her own casual cruelty, now contained something else entirely. It contained irrefutable proof of her own profound, embarrassing ignorance. It showed a true artist, a genuine prodigy, performing an original masterpiece, while she, Victoria, with her years of expensive top-tier private lessons, could barely stumble her way through a simplified version of Beethoven's Fr. Elise without making a mistake. The world, for the first time in her 16 years of privileged existence, was not reflecting back the image of herself that she had so carefully curated. The composition evolved, shifting into a more complex, turbulent movement. Sophia began to incorporate techniques she had secretly learned from Father Martinez, the secret master who had been her guide. She wove intricate jazz harmonies, learned from old crackling records the priest played for her, into the classical structure of the piece, creating something unique, something that spoke directly to the soul of anyone who was willing to listen. From the kitchen doorway, Carmen had moved forward, drawn into the room by the magnetic pull of her daughter's creation. Tears streamed freely down her face now, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of catharsis, of pride, of a fierce, protective love. She recognized every note, every pause, every soaring crescendo. That song, that beautiful, heartbreaking song, told their story. It was the story of a mother and a daughter, fighting with dignity and grace against a world that insisted on diminishing them, on rendering them invisible. Charles Morrison, the hotel magnate, had set down his glass of whiskey, his jaw slightly. Agape Margaret Steinberg, the oil tycoon's wife, held her breath, her surgically perfected face a mask of stunned disbelief. The other guests, the powerful, the wealthy, the self-important, were completely, utterly mesmerized. It wasn't possible. A 12-year-old girl, the daughter of a housekeeper, could not be playing with such mastery, with such emotional depth, with such compositional genius. It violated the natural laws of their universe. And then Sophia took the music to a level that none of them, not even the astonished Dr. Williams, were prepared for. Her small hands, which had seemed so delicate just moments before, became blurs of motion, executing a passage of such speed and technical complexity that it would have challenged the world's greatest virtuoso, the 2-100-and-50-1000-dollar Steinway. A magnificent instrument that had mostly served as a status symbol, a piece of decorative furniture, was finally, for the first time, being played by someone worthy of its potential. It sang, it roared, it wept. Dr. Patricia Williams, no longer caring about social etiquette or the proper decorum of a guest, walked fully into the room, her eyes locked on Sophia's hands. She moved to Robert's side, her voice an urgent, insistent whisper. "Robert, do you have any idea who that girl is?" "She's my maid's daughter," Robert replied, his own voice sounding strange and distant to his ears. The voice of a man in a dream. "Robert, I need to talk to her." Immediately, Patricia insisted, her professional instincts overriding everything else. "What we are hearing right now, it's extraordinary. This girl has a talent that comes along once in a generation, a talent that could change the face of modern classical music. The climax of the composition arrived like an emotional hurricane. Sophia, her eyes closed now, her body swaying with the rhythm of her own creation, channeled years of silent humiliation, of dreams whispered in the dark, of waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning to walk through the cold, dark streets to practice on a broken, out-of-tune piano. Each note carried the weight of 1,000 injustices and the unshakable strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. Victoria, her face pale, realized with a growing, sickening sense of horror that she was the one who had insisted that Sophia play. She was the one who had instigated this entire, catastrophic event. She was the one who had recorded everything, inadvertently creating a permanent, digital record of her own public humiliation. The video on her phone, which she had intended as a tool of mockery, now clearly and undeniably showed her own arrogance, being systematically dismantled, shattered by a display of pure, massad, unadulterated talent that she could never ever hope to achieve. When Sophia executed the final movement, a breathtaking passage that incorporated the complex, vibrant rhythms of Colombian classical music, a tribute to the secret lessons from the mother she adored, the emotion in the room was a palpable, living thing. There was something deeply, profoundly unfair happening here, and for the first time, every single person in that room knew it. Robert Whitmore, a man accustomed to being the most important, the most powerful, the most admired person in any room he entered, found himself completely, utterly diminished by a 12-year-old girl he had treated as a plaything, as a piece of cheap entertainment, and worse, he had done so in front of Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the most respected and influential music critics on the entire West Coast. The last notes of the composition echoed through the room, not as a whisper, but as a final, ringing judgment. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the polite, expectant silence of a concert hall. It was the stunned, heavy, uncomfortable silence of people who have just been forced to witness something that has completely and irrevocably shattered their worldview. Dr. Patricia Williams was the first to break the silence. She began to applaud, not the polite, perfunctory applause of a party guest, but a slow, deliberate, reverent ovation. "Extraordinary," she said, her voice heavy with both professional and personal emotion. "Absolutely, unequivocally, extraordinary." Sophia remained seated at the piano, her small hands resting lightly on the keys, her gaze fixed directly on Robert Whitmore. There was no arrogant triumph in her eyes. There was no "I told you so." There was only the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who had just proven a fundamental, irrefutable point about human value, about prejudice, and about the catastrophic era of hasty judgments. "That song," Sophia said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent, cavernous room, "is called Invisible. I wrote it thinking about all the people you see every day, but choose not to really see." Robert swallowed hard, the dry, painful scrape of a man finally, belatedly, understanding the full, staggering extent of his own ignorance. He had treated a genuine musical prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent, as a piece of domestic entertainment. Worse, he had done so with deliberate, malicious intent, for the sole purpose of humiliating her. Carmen, her face streaked with tears of pride, walked over to her daughter. For the first time in 12 years, she moved through the living room without asking permission, without concern for class protocols or invisible lines. She placed her hand on Sophia's shoulder, a simple, powerful gesture of a love and a pride she could no longer hide. Victoria looked down at the phone in her hands, the instrument of her own social demise. She realized, with a dawning, sickening certainty, that if this video were ever to be shared, and she knew with the instincts of her generation that it would be, her carefully curated social reputation would be destroyed. She would not be the witty, popular heiress. She would be the villain, the bully, the privileged, talentless girl who was publicly, spectacularly, put in her place. But what none of them knew yet, not even the astute Dr. Williams, was that the critic had recognized something more than just exceptional, raw talent in Sophia's performance. In the complex, intricate Colombian rhythms of the final movement, she had recognized a musical signature, a unique, unforgettable compositional voice that she had not heard in 15 years. The voice of Carmen Morales, the former first violinist of the Medellin Symphony Orchestra, a woman who had mysteriously, tragically disappeared from the international music scene after receiving the prestigious Latin Award for Musical Excellence. The guests slowly began to process what they had just witnessed, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before them. Patricia Williams approached Carmen, her eyes shining with a dawning, electrifying recognition. The night, she realized, was only just beginning to reveal its deepest, most astonishing secrets. Carmen Morales, Dr. Patricia Williams said, her voice a low, intense whisper that cut through the stunned silence of the room. She approached Sophia's mother, her eyes shining with the unmistakable light of recognition. First violinist of the Medellin Symphony Orchestra, you won the Latin Award for Musical Excellence in 2010, and then you disappeared. The silence in the room, which had been profound, now became deafening. Robert Whitmore, who just moments earlier had been reeling from the discovery that he had been treating a musical prodigy as a plaything, now had to process an even more devastating, more humiliating reality. His housekeeper, the quiet, invisible woman who had scrubbed his floors and washed his dishes for 12 years, was one of the most respected and celebrated classical musicians in all of Latin America. Carmen lifted her chin, and in that simple movement, she shed 15 years of silent, soul-crushing servitude. The stooped shoulders of the housekeeper straightened into the proud, elegant posture of the concert violinist. "Dr. Williams," she replied, her voice, though quiet, resonating with a dignity she had long been forced to bury. "It is an honor to see you again. You know her," Robert stammered, his face a mask of pale, slack-jawed disbelief. His entire world, his entire understanding of the social order, was crumbling around him in real time. Patricia turned to him, and the look in her eyes could have frozen hell. "Know her, Robert, you imbecile. You had one of the greatest musicians of her generation cleaning your toilets for over a decade, and you had her daughter, a child who is, without question, one of the most compositional prodigies I have ever seen in my 40-year career, serving your apps." Victoria, still clutching the smartphone that had documented her own spectacular social downfall, watched in abject horror as her privileged, perfect life imploded. The video she had recorded, the one meant to cement her status as a witty, untouchable queen of her social circle, now showed something else entirely. It showed a 12-year-old girl performing a musical masterpiece, while she, Victoria, the girl who had everything, stood by and mocked her. I didn't know," Robert whispered, the pathetic, universal excuse of the willfully ignorant. "Of course you didn't," Patricia replied, her voice dripping with a contempt that was as cold and as sharp as a shard of glass. "People like you never do. You see uniforms, not people. You hear accents, not stories. You see origins, not talent. You look, but you never, ever, see." Dr. Patricia Williams wasted no time. The next morning, her column in the Los Angeles Times was a devastating, surgical strike. An article titled, "The Symphony of Invisibility, How the Beverly Hills Elite Wastes Genius in Its Own Kitchens." The article was a masterpiece of journalistic righteous fury. It detailed not only Sophia's extraordinary once-in-a-generation talent, but also the criminal negligence of a society that allows a woman like Carmen Morales, a celebrated artist, to be reduced to a life of domestic servitude. The story exploded. Victoria's video leaked by one of the party guests who had a conscience, or perhaps just a good sense of a viral story, spread across social media like a wildfire. But it did not spread in the way she had ever intended. The hashtag privileged girl gets owned went viral, racking up 15 million views in the first 48 hours. The comments were a relentless, brutal torrent of public shaming. Imagine paying thousands for piano lessons and still being humiliated by a 12-year-old girl who learned in a church. That's the difference between privilege and pure, unadulterated talent. This is the most satisfying video I have ever seen. Arrogance getting shattered live on air. The look on her face when she realizes the little maid is a genius is my new screensaver. Robert Whitmore hired one of the most expensive and ruthless public relations firms in the country to try and control the damage, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. It was too late. The story was too perfect. The heroes too sympathetic. The villains too perfectly, cartoonishly arrogant. The Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra, facing a public relations nightmare of its own for having overlooked a major talent, living in its own city, immediately offered Carmen a position as assistant conductor. The Curtis Institute of Music, the most prestigious conservatory in the country, offered Sophia a full all-expense-paid scholarship, including room and board for both her and her mother. 3 major record labels entered into a fierce bidding war for the rights to record Sophia's original composition, Invisible. Victoria, unable to cope with the relentless public humiliation, the endless stream of mocking memes, the sudden, complete abandonment by her fair-weather high society friends, was quietly admitted to a private rehabilitation clinic. For what the family spokesperson called nervous exhaustion, the elite's preferred euphemism for a mental breakdown caused by public shame, her social media accounts, once a curated shrine to her own fabulousness, were deactivated, but not before they had been thoroughly screenshotted and archived. A permanent digital monument to her own downfall, Robert lost 3 major real estate contracts in the first week as his business partners, men who were just as prejudiced as he was, but far more Sambi, scrambled to distance themselves from the man who had become the national symbol of blind, arrogant privilege. His reputation, in the exclusive, insular world of Beverly Hills, was ruined. Ironically, the man who had tried to use a 12-year-old girl as a piece of cheap entertainment had turned out to be the real clown in the situation. 6 months later, Sophia made her official debut at the Walt Disney Concert Hall. She performed her composition, Invisible, with the full Los Angeles Philharmonic. The orchestra was conducted by her mother, Carmen Morales, who stood on the podium, her back straight, her baton steady, having triumphantly, miraculously, resumed the career that had been stolen from her 15 years earlier. The performance was broadcast nationally on PBS and raised over $2 million for a new music scholarship fund for underprivileged children, a fund named, at Sophia's insistence, the Father Martinez Grant. In the audience, in one of the cheapest seats in the upper balcony, the only ticket he could afford after his financial empire had begun to crumble under the weight of his public disgrace, sat Robert Whitmore. He had tried to sue Patricia Williams and the Los Angeles Times for defamation, but had quickly discovered that every single word of her scathing article was meticulously sourced and legally airtight. At his side, in the seat that his wife should have occupied, was an empty space. She had served him with divorce papers the week after the article was published. Tired, she had said in her own public statement, of being married to a man who was morally and intellectually bankrupt. During the performance, when Sophia played the final, soaring movement of Invisible, a passage that was no longer about pain and humiliation, but about triumph and hope, she glanced up briefly at the audience. For a fleeting second her eyes met Robert's. There was no anger in her gaze, there was no gloating, there was only the quiet, unshakable dignity of someone who had turned humiliation into a masterpiece, who had transformed pain into a thing of profound, transcendent beauty. The lesson, for anyone who was paying attention, was crystal clear. Robert Whitmore had tried to use Sophia as a prop, a piece of cheap entertainment to amuse his wealthy friends. Instead, she had used her own God-given talent to show the entire world who really deserved to be invisible. True justice, she had taught them all, was not about destroying Robert Whitmore. It was about building something so magnificent, so meaningful, so undeniably brilliant, that he could never hope to understand it, let alone achieve it. While he languished in the social and financial irrelevance he had so cruelly tried to impose on others, Sophia and Carmen built a musical legacy that would inspire generations. Today, 5 years later, Sophia is considered one of the most promising and innovative young composers in the United States. Carmen runs the Los Angeles Youth Orchestra, a program that provides free, world-class musical opportunities to thousands of children from underserved communities. Victoria still lives in relative seclusion, her social media career permanently, irrevocably destroyed by the video she herself recorded, and Robert finally learned the true meaning of the word invisible. It's not about being ignored, it's about being irrelevant. The difference is that Sophia chose her invisibility as a strategy, as a shield. He earned his as a consequence. If this story touched your heart and showed you that real talent knows no zip code, no social class, no color of skin, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that underestimating the right people can be the most expensive and most humiliating mistake you will ever make.